Back in the early 2000s, Elon Musk went through a time when everything seemed to be falling apart. He had worked for seemed to be slipping through his fingers. It wasn't a time of headlines, praise, or billion-dollar valuations. It was a time of doubt, sleepless nights, and a bank account that was shrinking faster than anyone could imagine. To the outside world, Elon Musk might have looked like a bold entrepreneur chasing impossible dreams. But behind the scenes, he was a man taking risks so big that one wrong step could have wiped out everything he owned. After selling PayPal, Musk suddenly had more money than he had ever imagined growing up in South Africa. Most people in his position would have bought mansions, yachts, and a lifetime of comfort. But Elon wasn't wired that way. Comfort never excited him. The future did. He believed humanity needed to become a multiplanetary species, and he believed electric vehicles could end the world's dependence on fossil fuels. Those weren't small ideas. They were ideas that required enormous risk, enormous investment, and enormous patience, so instead of protecting his wealth, Elon did something almost nobody else would have done. He poured nearly all of it into 3 companies at once: SpaceX, Tesla, and SolarCity. Each of those companies was seen as risky on its own. Together, they were considered almost reckless. Friends, advisors, and even family members warned him that he was spreading himself too thin. They told him he should focus on just one company. But Elon believed these missions were connected. They were all about the future of humanity, and he didn't want to choose between them. SpaceX was perhaps the biggest gamble of all. The idea of a private company building rockets sounded like science fiction at the time. Space travel was something only governments did. NASA, Russia, China, these were the names associated with rockets, not startups. But Elon believed the cost of space travel could be dramatically reduced. He believed rockets could be built more efficiently, and eventually reused, like airplanes. But belief alone wasn't enough. He needed results. The first 3 SpaceX rocket launches all failed. Each failure was a crushing blow. Rockets exploded. Years of work turned into smoke and fire in a matter of seconds. And each explosion burned not just fuel, but millions of dollars. Elon had poured his own money into the company, and with every failed launch, the bank balance dropped closer to zero. Engineers were exhausted. The media was skeptical. Critics were loud. Many people started calling SpaceX a fantasy that would never work. At the same time, Tesla was struggling too. Building an electric car from scratch was far more difficult than anyone had expected. Costs were rising. Production delays were constant. The company was burning through cash at an alarming rate. Investors were nervous. Some believed Tesla would collapse before it ever delivered a real product to customers. By 2008, everything was coming to a breaking point. SpaceX had enough money left for just one more launch. 1. If the 4th rocket failed, the company would almost certainly go bankrupt. And if SpaceX collapsed, it would drag down Tesla with it. Elon himself was nearly out of personal funds. The fortune he had made from PayPal was almost gone. He had invested so much into his companies that he was borrowing money for personal expenses. At one point, he reportedly had to choose between paying rent and funding the companies. This was the risk that almost cost him everything. Imagine being in his position. Years of effort. All your savings gone. Public criticism growing louder. Employees depending on you. And only one final shot left before everything collapses. Most people would have walked away long before reaching that point. They would have protected what they had left. They would have chosen safety over ambition, but Elon didn't walk away. He gathered his team for the 4th SpaceX launch. There was tension in the air. Everyone knew what was at stake. This wasn't just another test. This was survival. If the rocket failed, it wasn't just a technical problem. It was the end of the company, the end of the dream, and the end of the risk he had taken. The rocket lifted off. Seconds passed. Then minutes. And this time, it didn't explode. The rocket reached orbit successfully. For the first time, SpaceX had done what only a few governments in the world had ever achieved. The room erupted in celebration. Engineers hugged each other. Some cried. Years of failure, stress, and doubt were suddenly replaced with relief and hope. That successful launch changed everything. Soon after, NASA awarded SpaceX a contract worth over $1 billion. The company that had been on the edge of collapse suddenly had a future. Investors regained confidence. Employees felt a new sense of purpose. SpaceX wasn't just a risky startup anymore. It was a serious player in the space industry. But the story didn't end there. At the same time, Tesla was also on the brink of failure. The global financial crisis had hit, and investors were extremely cautious. Money was hard to find. The company needed funding immediately, or it would shut down. Elon personally invested the last of his money into Tesla to keep it alive. It was a desperate move, but he believed the company still had a chance. On Christmas Eve of 2008, Tesla closed a critical funding round. It was just enough to keep the company alive. That moment, quiet and almost unnoticed by the world, was one of the most important turning points in Tesla's history. Without that funding, Tesla would have disappeared before the Model S. Before the Gigafactories, before becoming the electric car giant it is today. By the end of that year, both SpaceX and Tesla had survived. Barely. It was like two people clinging to the edge of a cliff, pulling themselves up at the last possible moment. And at the center of it all was a man who had risked nearly everything he had to make those dreams real. Looking back now, it's easy to see Elon Musk as one of the richest and most influential entrepreneurs in the world. It's easy to think success was inevitable for someone with his intelligence and ambition. But that's not the truth. There was a moment when everything was about to fall apart. A moment when one more failure would have erased years of work and every dollar he had. That's what makes the story powerful. It wasn't just about technology or business. It was about belief. It was about the willingness to risk comfort for a vision. It was about standing in the middle of chaos and choosing not to give up. The risk that almost cost Elon Musk everything is the same risk that built his legacy. Without that dangerous period, there would be no reusable rockets landing upright on drone ships. There would be no Tesla vehicles dominating electric car sales. There would be no global conversation about colonizing Mars. Sometimes, the greatest successes are born in the moments when everything seems lost. And sometimes, the difference between failure and history-changing achievement is just one last attempt. One last decision to keep going when it feels impossible. In 2008, Elon Musk stood at that exact point. And instead of stepping back, he leaned forward into the risk. That choice didn't just save his companies. It reshaped industries and inspired millions of people around the world, because the truth is, the risk that almost cost him everything was also the risk that gave him everything. As the dust settled after that brutal year, something inside Elon Musk had changed. The experience of standing on the edge of financial ruin, watching rockets explode and companies teeter on the brink of collapse, had stripped away any illusion that success was guaranteed. He had stared directly into the possibility of losing everything, and somehow, he had kept going. That year didn't just test his companies. It tested his character. When SpaceX's fourth launch succeeded and NASA offered the contract that would save the company, it felt less like a victory and more like survival. There was relief, but there was also exhaustion. Years of relentless pressure had taken a toll. Friends later described him as looking worn down, thinner, and constantly stressed. He wasn't celebrating in luxury. He was simply grateful that the dream hadn't died. At the same time, Tesla's last-minute funding on Christmas Eve was like a quiet miracle. While most people around the world were celebrating the holidays, Elon was fighting to keep his company alive. When the deal finally closed, it wasn't champagne and parties. It was a deep breath after nearly drowning. Those moments didn't just save SpaceX and Tesla. They reshaped how Elon approached risk. He had learned something most entrepreneurs never experience: what it feels like when everything is truly on the line. Not just a percentage of wealth, not just reputation, but everything. He had nothing left to prove about his willingness to take risks, but instead of becoming more cautious, the experience made him even more determined. Surviving that storm gave him confidence that impossible problems could be solved with enough persistence. If he could bring a private rocket company back from near collapse, what else might be possible? That mindset became the foundation for everything that followed. SpaceX didn't stop at one successful launch. It pushed forward with reusable rockets, a concept many experts had dismissed as unrealistic. Engineers worked tirelessly, failing again and again as rockets tipped over or exploded during landing attempts. But the memory of 2008 hung in the air like a silent reminder. Failure wasn't the end. It was part of the process. Eventually, the Falcon 9 landed successfully for the first time. It was a moment that changed the economics of space travel forever. Rockets that once burned up in the atmosphere could now be used again. Costs dropped. Opportunities expanded. What once seemed like science fiction became routine. Tesla's journey followed a similar path. The company faced production nightmares, public criticism, and financial challenges even after surviving 2008. There were times when factories struggled, when deadlines were missed, and when skeptics predicted the company's collapse. But Elon had already lived through the worst. He had seen his bank account nearly hit zero. He had felt the weight of thousands of employees depending on decisions he made. Compared to that, every new challenge was just another obstacle to overcome. Over the years, Tesla grew from a struggling startup into the world's most valuable car company. Electric vehicles, once considered a niche curiosity, became a global movement. Governments, competitors, and consumers all began to take them seriously. The company that nearly died in 2008 became the symbol of the future of transportation, and through it all, that critical period never really left Elon's story. It became a kind of invisible chapter that explained everything else. The bold decisions. The sleepless nights. The relentless pace. The refusal to accept limits. All of it made more sense when you understood what he had been through, because once you face the possibility of losing everything, your relationship with fear changes. You realize that comfort is temporary. You realize that playing it safe doesn't always lead to a meaningful life. And you begin to see risk not as something to avoid, but as something to manage, something to face with courage. For Elon, the risk that almost destroyed him became the fuel that pushed him forward. It reminded him why he started in the first place. Not for money. Not for fame. But for ideas that felt bigger than himself. That's why, even after becoming one of the richest people in the world, he kept taking risks. Launching Starship. Building massive gigafactories. Pushing forward with ambitious timelines that others called impossible. The stakes were different now, but the mindset was the same. He had learned that the line between failure and success is often thinner than people think. Sometimes it's just one more attempt. One more launch. One more investment. One more moment of refusing to quit. If the fourth SpaceX rocket had failed, the world might look very different today. There might be no reusable rockets landing on drone ships. Electric cars might still be considered a fringe idea. The name Elon Musk might be remembered as another entrepreneur who tried something bold and ran out of money. But that's not what happened. One launch succeeded. One funding round closed. 1 year ended with survival instead of collapse. And from that narrow escape, two of the most influential companies of the 21st century continued their journey. That is the quiet truth behind the headlines and the billion-dollar valuations. Before the success, before the global recognition, there was a moment when everything nearly disappeared, and in that moment, the risk that almost cost Elon Musk everything became the very reason he has what he has today. Because he didn't step back. He didn't protect what was left. He chose to keep going, even when the odds said he shouldn't. Sometimes, the greatest turning points in life don't look like victories at all. They look like desperation, uncertainty, and one final chance. But for those willing to hold on, those moments can become the foundation of something extraordinary.